Welcome to lesson 4 of getting out of our own way, making friends with ego and resistance on the spiritual path. Today we're going to look at the topic of self-compassion and intention in spiritual practice. So what we've been saying so far is that it is our very own self, it is our ego that gets in our way, that creates barriers and obstructions when we're on a spiritual path. What we've learned is that the ego at all costs wants to protect itself from any threat to itself. The ego's greatest fear is its own demise. The ego's greatest fear is death. For some, when we have a spiritual experience, the ego can perceive that as a kind of death, as kind of a being snuffed out, because in truth, when we have a deep spiritual experience, there is this merging with the great consciousness that happens. And that can be unsettling to the ego, which likes to form itself and not change, which also resists change. Well, because the ego may resist these experiences, the ego is likely to also resist our attempts to have a spiritual practice. So it comes up with all kinds of excuses as to why we shouldn't practice, why we don't have time, why we have too many other very important things to do. The ego is absorbed with external reality, and it's always processing external reality. It doesn't pause to look within very often. And yet when we can work with our ego so that we do look within, then that's when we get in touch with a higher consciousness. What we learned last time is the Purusha, the Purushaic self, that level of self that is very connected with the universal, that is connected with the divine, so to speak. By turning inward like this, we can really come into our own true sense of goodness, of well-being. And if we do this enough without telling the ego it's not allowed to continue to exist, then we actually naturally begin to make friends with the ego. And that's one of the things that I think is so important to realize. We can work with our ego to quiet down, we can pat it on the head and say, good little ego, and you just rest here while I meditate. But the thing is that actually by doing our spiritual practices, there's a natural friendliness that does occur to our own egoic self. And so the ego doesn't have to be threatened any longer. That's really the good news. So if we keep practicing, eventually, those demands of the ego are going to subside. So are its anxieties and its worries and its annoyances, its irritations. And we'll find that we really do begin to change and transform. So this is the good thing. So we can make friends with the ego through meditation, but we also can do certain activities that are going to accelerate this process. And one of those is to be compassionate toward ourselves. We tend, with our own ego, to upbraid ourselves when we fall short of our own expectations. And the truth is, we need to begin to understand that when we are operating out there in the world, we're making decisions constantly. We're moving back and forth between various stressful situations, and the ego is not always going to have all the resources of the inner consciousness available to it, and it's going to do some things that we might regret, kind of say some stupid things. And we do this all the time. We need to learn to be spacious with ourselves, to forgive ourselves, to ask for forgiveness from someone else if we've actually done something to offend. But we need to start practicing self-compassion. Research is actually showing that people who are more compassionate with themselves, who accept their shortcomings and their foibles and then can go on about their business, are actually happier people. They're less depressed, they're less anxious, they're more optimistic people. So this is something that we can actively do. When we catch ourselves doing, thinking, saying, being a way that we really don't like about ourselves, instead of adding punishment on to having made a mistake, to simply give ourselves the space to say to ourselves, to do some self-talk, which says, okay, there it is. I did that again. It's not my happiest moment, but it's okay. I understand. I'm compassionate toward myself. You were feeling bad in the moment. Your feelings were hurt. You said that thing. Okay. And now I love you and we're going to move on. And beginning to be compassionate with yourself, you'll become more compassionate with others as well. So our sadhana, our spiritual practice, really represents the challenge of riding the waves of the inner and the outward flow of attention. Again, our attention is out there, we're making decisions right and left, we're not always behaving in ways that are perfectly consonant with how our interior self wants us to be. So be it. We just go back to our practice and back to our practice and back to our practice. Because you see, the ego will start to tell us, there's no point in me being on this spiritual path. I can't live up to it. I just can't do that work. It's too hard. I'm not good. I just want to have fun. Leave me alone. And the ego will go on like that. Again, okay, ego, I hear your protests. I hear your whining. I hear your crying. I get it. I'm tired too. And of course, this is the self-talk that we're doing. And okay, let's rest. Let's just rest. Let's give this some space and let's rest. And sometimes what we actually need is actual physical rest. We need to simply let our bodies relax. And then we can also rest in our meditation. So we invite the ego to join us in our meditation. It'll come along anyway. It is part of us. The ego, of course, would sometimes much rather forget itself in mindless activity, and there are going to be times when we get engaged in mindless activity. That's perfectly all right. We just want to make sure that we also give ourselves that time once or twice a day to be mindful, to meditate, to practice. So be compassionate with your shenpas, your attachments. Be compassionate in terms of how you like to assert your roles and your identities. And be compassionate. Let yourself engage in your spiritual practice. Stop fighting yourself to do it. So there's something I want to talk about, which I call intention. And intention means setting the intention to take the attention inward. And this is something we need to remind ourselves to do again and again. The attention naturally flows outward. We want to bring it in. So again, we have the intention to bring attention in. Paramahansa Yogananda, autobiography of a yogi read by so many people in our Western culture, talks a great deal about attention. And basically he says that where attention goes, the entire being follows. So that if my attention is on my video game, my whole being is in my video game. If my attention is toward God, then my being becomes God. The Tibetan Book of the Dead talks about where the attention goes at the moment of death and how important that is in terms of what happens next, so to speak. That moment is crucial because, as the Tibetan Book of the Dead describes it, what one can see, kind of like Arjuna looking at the mouth of Krishna, can be overwhelming, it can be frightening because it is so great. One must be trained to hold one's attention right there so that one can traverse into the great realms. So wherever you point your attention, there you are, so to speak. Therefore, have the intention for your attention to be inward. Can you do both inward and outward attention at the same time? Actually, eventually, one can do that on the path with practice. Often, though, it's a flow back and forth, back and forth. It needs to be a gentle flow. So it's not like we notice, oh, gosh, I'm watching the cat over there and I'm getting way involved in that. Oh, I got to bring my attention back in. No, it's like I can be watching the cat and I can also be noticing my inward experience. So we just do this gently. We move back and forth gently and easily. As we do this, each time we come in, and we can do this on a breath, each time we come in, we connect more with that sattvic self that we referred to earlier, with that luminous being that we are within. And we carry a little of that back out. This is exactly what we want. We want the outward flow of attention to reflect the inner attention, the interior being, the higher self, the higher consciousness. So the key, truly, to making friends with ego and resistance is to not fight it. It's to not fight the ego, to not fight its impulses, to not fight its little addictions and attachments. We accept, we forgive, we breathe through, we make space, we move on, and we do our practices. We go off the path, we come back on the path. Attention goes out, attention comes back in. And that actually is the path. When we catch ourselves judging ourselves because we're not moving ahead as quickly as we would like, we give that judgment space, we breathe through it, we understand that this is part of the natural process. It's what the ego does. We accept it, we befriend it, we breathe again, we come back. We really can't shame ourselves into enlightenment. And yet, sometimes it feels like that's what we're trying to do. By telling ourselves how we're not doing this and we're not doing that, telling yourself that you're no good, it doesn't work. What we need to do is bring ourselves into enlightenment by placing ourselves in the light of our own consciousness. We step outside the limits of ordinary consciousness by tapping into the interior or extraordinary consciousness. It's as simple as that. We don't push ordinary consciousness away. We simply step within. I want to tell you a story. I think it was in Pema Chodron's book, but I've heard this story many times. It's the story of a Native American grandfather who was coping with his own feelings after 9/11. And he was trying to talk to his grandson about it. And basically, he said to his grandson that it felt to him like there were two wolves inside of his heart, two hungry wolves. And one of those wolves wanted revenge and wanted violence. And the other wolf wanted understanding and forgiveness. And these wolves were fighting one another. And the grandson said, well, grandfather, which one of the wolves is going to win? And he turned to his grandson and he said, it's the one that I feed that will win. So the story of the hungry wolves demonstrates that which part of the self do we wish to feed? We can feed the selfish, self-protective, self-aggrandizing, egoic self, or we can feed that part of us that is connected with something higher. How do we feed that? Well, we feed it through our practice. We feed it by turning the attention within. So I would like to do a guided meditation today, again with the Hamsa, but I'm going to invite you this time to do it without following the breath. So last time I had you do the Hamsa. You inhaled thinking hum, and you exhaled thinking sa. Now remember, Hamsa means I am that. We don't have to even be thinking consciously of what it means, but rather what we're wanting is to actually have that experience of that which I am. And so this time you're going to be doing it completely silently. You're not going to be breathing in hum and exhaling sa. You're just going to be thinking hum sa, hum sa, hum sa. So go ahead now and close your eyes and let me guide you through this. Make sure your feet are rooted into the earth and that you're comfortable in your chair. Take a couple of deep sighing breaths in through the nose and out through the mouth. And just let the vibration, the pulsation of Hamsa repeat inside your mind. You can actively think the mantra Hum Sa. But it's almost as if the thought itself aligns you with a pulsation of vibration that is already there within. You are being aligned with the very nature of your own being. As soon as the mind starts thinking thoughts, as soon as the flow of attention is directed outward, simply repeat the mantra again and again and again. Befriending those thoughts, not aggressively pushing them away. Just bring your attention back to the already vibrating, the already pulsating mantra Hum Sa. I am that. If you wish, you can continue to silently repeat Hum Sa for a few more minutes. Take this practice with you in the coming weeks. Allow it to be a daily practice if you like. And in the coming weeks, see if you can choose to feed the wolf that wants to connect with the higher self, with the divine. Notice when you think and act from your higher self and give space to that. Notice when you think and react from your ordinary consciousness and offer yourself compassion and forgiveness. Actually begin to let those two wolves work in harmony. You remember that turning inward does not mean withdrawal from the world, but turning within allows us to truly love both ourselves and our neighbor, and to see our neighbor as our self. Self here with the uppercase. The Greek Stoic philosopher Epictetus said, "Ever seeking peace outside yourself, you will never be able to be at peace. For you seek it where it is not, and refused to seek it within." Make friends with your outer self and commune with the divine within. Hum Sa. I am that.